Picture this. You're sitting down to a bowl of stew that's been cooking continuously for 500 years. The same pot, the same fire, never extinguished, outlasting wars, plagues, and entire dynasties. Sounds impossible? Well, buckle up, because you're about to discover that medieval people weren't just surviving on turnip gruel and prayers. They were culinary masterminds who developed food hacks so brilliant that modern chefs are desperately trying to recreate them. And the best part? We threw away most of their secrets for the convenience of a microwave and the false promise that newer is always better. 1. The never-ending meal, perpetual stews that outlived kingdoms. Let's start with something that'll blow your mind. There was a stew pot in Perpignan, France, that bubbled away continuously from the 15th century until World War II. That's right, the same stew, cooking for over 500 years. Your great-great-great-great-grandmother could have eaten from the same pot as Napoleon soldiers. Talk about family recipes. You're probably thinking this sounds like a medieval health nightmare, some bubbling cauldron of plague and pestilence. But here's the kicker, it wasn't. The perpetual stew was actually one of the most brilliant food innovations in human history, and we abandoned it because we thought we knew better. So how did this magical, never-ending meal work? Picture walking into a medieval kitchen, and there it is, a massive iron kettle, sometimes holding 20 gallons or more, suspended over a fire that never goes out. The pot is never empty, never fully cleaned, and never stops cooking. It's like the Energizer Bunny of medieval cuisine, except instead of annoying everyone with drums, it's feeding entire households for centuries. The system worked by maintaining a large kettle permanently suspended over a low fire, never completely emptied, but constantly replenished with new ingredients. Every morning, the cook would peer into the pot, taste what was there, and add whatever was available. Leftover vegetables from last night's dinner, into the pot. Scraps of meat from the butcher, in they go. Stale bread, perfect for thickening. Bones with marrow, flavor gold. But this wasn't just medieval laziness or some primitive, throw everything together and hope for the best approach. This was sophisticated resource management that would make modern efficiency experts weep with envy. Think about it. Medieval households didn't have the luxury of wasting fuel. Firewood was expensive, dangerous to gather, and required constant attention to maintain. Starting a fire from scratch every day was a massive undertaking that consumed time, resources, and energy. This technique saved enormous amounts of fuel by eliminating the need to repeatedly heat pots from cold, a crucial consideration when firewood was expensive and dangerous to gather. The perpetual stew solved this problem with elegant simplicity. Keep the fire low, keep the pot cooking, and you got a meal ready 24/7 without the energy cost of starting over each day. Now, you might be wondering about food safety. Surely keeping food at low temperatures for extended periods is a recipe for disaster? Actually, no. The key was maintaining the right temperature, hot enough to kill harmful bacteria, around 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 degrees Celsius, but low enough to prevent the stew from burning or reducing too quickly. Medieval cooks didn't understand the science of bacteria, but they figured out through trial and error that as long as the stew stayed bubbling and hot, it remained safe to eat. The magic happened in the layering of flavors. Medieval cooks would add vegetables, grains, meat scraps, and herbs daily, creating a continuously evolving meal that captured every bit of flavor and nutrition. Imagine the complexity that developed over weeks, months, or even years of this process. Each day's additions melded with the previous day's flavors, creating depth that no single cooking session could achieve. The only time the pot was completely emptied was during Lent, when meat was forbidden by the church. Even then, it wasn't discarded. It was cleaned and immediately restarted with vegetables, grains, and fish. Some households maintained separate pots for meat days and Lent days, doubling down on the perpetual stew strategy. The stew was based on whatever was available, with new ingredients just dumped on top of the old ones, creating an ongoing edible experiment. This wasn't random. Experienced cooks developed sophisticated understanding of which ingredients complemented each other, how different additions affected the overall flavor profile, and what combinations worked best for different seasons. The social aspect was equally important. The perpetual stew could feed unexpected guests at a moment's notice. Crucial in an era when hospitality was both a social obligation and a survival strategy. Travelers, relatives, or neighbors could be fed immediately without the time and expense of preparing a meal from scratch. In a world without restaurants or takeout, this was the ultimate convenience food. But here's where it gets really interesting. The perpetual stew actually improved nutrition. The long, slow cooking process broke down tough plant fibers, making vegetables more digestible and nutrients more bioavailable. Bones would slowly release their marrow and gelatin, creating a nutrient-dense broth packed with minerals and proteins. The fermentation that occurred at the surface added beneficial bacteria that aided digestion. Modern science has confirmed what medieval cooks knew instinctively. Slow cooking at low temperatures preserves more vitamins and minerals than high-heat cooking methods. The perpetual stew was essentially a medieval slow cooker that ran on autopilot, creating more nutritious meals with less effort than conventional cooking methods. The technique spread across Europe with regional variations. In Ireland, the caul tradition maintained similar principles, but with locally available ingredients. German households developed their own perpetual soup traditions, often featuring different combinations of grains and preserved meats. Italian monasteries maintained cauldrons that fed entire religious communities for decades. Each household developed its own signature flavors based on local ingredients, family preferences, and regional traditions. Some specialized in hearty meat-based stews, others focused on vegetable combinations, and still others created sweet-savory combinations that modern palates would find exotic. The perpetual stew became a reflection of the family's identity, their unique contribution to the neighborhood's culinary landscape. So why did we abandon this brilliant system? The answer is depressingly predictable: industrialization and the illusion of progress. As metal became cheaper and stoves more efficient, people began to value the appearance of cleanliness over actual effectiveness. The perpetual stew looked primitive compared to shiny new cookware and scheduled meal preparation. We traded efficiency and flavor for the illusion of sophistication. The final nail in the coffin came with modern food safety regulations. Health inspectors, armed with incomplete understanding of how the system actually worked, saw the perpetual stew as a contamination risk rather than a sophisticated preservation method. The technique was banned in most commercial establishments and gradually disappeared from home kitchens as well. Today, the closest we come to perpetual stews are the occasional restaurant that maintains a stock pot for several days, or the home cook who keeps a slow cooker running for a weekend. We've lost centuries of accumulated wisdom about flavor development, resource efficiency, and community feeding in favor of individual meal preparation that wastes energy, time, and food. But here's the beautiful irony. Modern chefs are now desperately trying to recreate the complex flavors that perpetual stews achieve naturally. High-end restaurants spend thousands on equipment and ingredients to develop the layered tastes that medieval households created automatically through their daily cooking routine. The perpetual stew represents everything we've forgotten about sustainable living. It minimized waste, maximized nutrition, required minimal energy, and created community around shared meals. In our rush toward modernity, we abandoned a technique that was more efficient, more nutritious, and more delicious than most of what we've replaced it with. Maybe it's time to bring back the never-ending meal. 2. Edible dishes and disposable cookware. When your plate was dinner. So you've got your perpetual stew bubbling away, feeding the household for months on end. But here's the problem. What do you serve it in? In a world where metal was expensive, ceramic dishes were luxury items, and even wooden bowls were precious enough to be passed down through generations, medieval cooks faced a serious tableware shortage. Their solution? Make the dishes edible too. Welcome to the world of huff paste and coffin crusts. Medieval cookware that you could literally eat when you were done with your meal. And no, this wasn't some desperate poverty measure or a primitive attempt at convenience. This was sophisticated culinary engineering that solved multiple problems at once while creating some of the most ingenious cooking techniques ever developed. Picture this. You're a medieval cook preparing for a feast. You need to serve 30 people, but you only own 6 actual bowls. What do? You grab some flour, some suet, boiling water, and you make your own disposable dinnerware. By the time you're done, you'll have created waterproof, airtight containers that can cook food, preserve it for months, transport across continents, and then be eaten as part of the meal. Try doing that with your modern Tupperware. The technique centered around something called huff paste, a mixture of flour, suet, and boiling water that formed rock-hard pastry shells when cooked. This wasn't bread dough or pie crust as we know it today. This was medieval industrial engineering disguised as baking, creating containers that were tougher than many modern food storage solutions. The process started with coarsely ground rye flour. Not the refined white flour we use today, but rough, sturdy grain that had enough structure to hold its shape under pressure. Medieval cooks mixed this flour with suet, hard fat from around animal kidneys, and poured boiling water over the mixture while stirring frantically. The boiling water partially cooked the flour and melted the suet, creating a moldable paste that could be shaped around food. But here's where it gets really clever. They didn't just make random containers. Medieval cooks created elaborate molds called coffins. Yes, like coffins, because that's essentially what they were for the food. These pastry shells were shaped specifically for different types of meals, with thick walls that could withstand hours of cooking and tight-fitting lids that created airtight seals. The technique allowed safe transport of cooked meals over long distances and provided even, moist heat similar to modern slow-cooking methods. Think about that for a moment. They created a medieval version of vacuum-sealed cooking, complete with its own serving dish, using nothing but flour, fat, and hot water. The sealed environment steamed food gently, while the hard crust prevented contamination. The science behind this is actually remarkable. The huff paste hardened during cooking, creating a waterproof barrier that was essentially impermeable to bacteria and air. Inside this sealed environment, food cooked in its own juices, developing complex flavors through steam and slow braising. The thick walls provided insulation that maintained even temperatures, preventing hot spots that could burn the food or cold spots that might harbor bacteria. These edible containers could preserve food for months without refrigeration, making them the ultimate medieval meal prep solution. A properly made coffin filled with cooked meat could last for weeks or even months when stored in cool, dry conditions. The pastry crust formed such an effective barrier that archaeologists have found examples of these containers in medieval ruins with the contents still intact after centuries. But not all huff paste was created equal. The thick, industrial-strength version was primarily functional. After cooking, the pastry was typically discarded because it was too tough and flavorless to be appetizing. However, servants and workers often ate these crusts anyway, as they absorbed all the delicious juices and flavors from the food inside. It was like getting a free meal along with your food storage container. For wealthier households, cooks developed more refined versions using better flour and additional ingredients that created edible crusts worthy of the noble table. These eating crusts were thinner, more flavorful, and designed to be consumed as part of the meal. They represented the difference between disposable packaging and actual dinnerware. Both served the same basic function, but with very different expectations for consumption. The technique wasn't limited to savory applications either. Medieval cooks created sweet versions for preserving fruits, nuts, and honey-based confections. Imagine biting into what appears to be a pastry shell only to discover an interior filled with preserved pears, nuts, and spiced honey that had been aging for months, developing flavors that would make modern dessert chefs weep with envy. The practical applications extended far beyond simple food storage. These edible containers revolutionized medieval catering and hospitality. A noble household could prepare elaborate meals weeks in advance, store them safely, and serve them at a moment's notice without any degradation in quality. For medieval society, where unexpected guests were common and hospitality was a social obligation, this was transformative technology. Traveling merchants and pilgrims carried these sealed food containers as portable meals that wouldn't spoil during long journeys. Unlike modern trail mix or energy bars, these containers provided complete, restaurant-quality meals that could be eaten cold or quickly reheated over any fire. They were the medieval equivalent of military MREs, except they actually tasted good. The technique also enabled what we might call medieval meal delivery services. Cookshops in cities would prepare these sealed containers and sell them to customers who lacked kitchen facilities. Urban workers living in cramped quarters without cooking space could purchase complete meals that would stay fresh for days. The containers doubled as both packaging and plates, eliminating the need for customers to own their own dinnerware. Professional bakers developed specialized techniques for mass-producing these containers, creating standardized sizes and shapes for different purposes. Large coffins for family meals, individual portions for traveling, specialized shapes for different types of food, and decorative versions for special occasions. It was an entire industry built around edible packaging that employed thousands of workers across medieval Europe. The most sophisticated examples were true works of art. Wealthy households commissioned elaborate coffins shaped like castles, animals, or heraldic symbols. These weren't just functional containers, but status symbols that demonstrated the family's wealth and sophistication. The pastry shells were decorated, colored with natural dyes, and crafted with the same attention to detail as jewelry or tapestries. Archaeological evidence suggests that some households maintained specialized equipment just for coffin production, molds, shapers, and tools designed specifically for creating these edible containers. This represents significant investment in what was essentially packaging technology, indicating how valuable and widespread the technique had become. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of this system was its environmental efficiency. Unlike modern packaging that creates massive waste streams, every component of the medieval system was either consumed or naturally biodegradable. The food was eaten, the container was eaten or fed to animals, and nothing was left behind except satisfied customers and clean plates. The technique began to disappear during the Renaissance as metal became cheaper and ceramic production improved. Wealthy households started to view edible containers as primitive compared to fancy imported dishes and elaborate silverware. The rise of permanent tableware meant that disposable containers seemed unnecessary and unsophisticated. But we lost something important when we abandoned this technology. Modern food packaging creates enormous environmental waste, requires industrial production facilities, and often introduces chemicals and preservatives into our food supply. The medieval system achieved better preservation results using completely natural ingredients while creating zero waste. Today, high-end restaurants are experimenting with edible packaging and serving containers, but they're essentially rediscovering techniques that medieval cooks perfected centuries ago. The difference is that modern versions are novelty items served to impress diners, while medieval edible containers were practical solutions to real problems. The coffin tradition represents medieval innovation at its finest, taking limited resources and creating elegant solutions that solved multiple problems simultaneously. It was sustainable packaging, food preservation, cooking vessel, and serving dish all rolled into one ingenious technique that fed millions of people for centuries. And the best part? When you're done eating, there were no dishes to wash. 3. Fermentation wizardry. Creating 28 types of bacteria before knowing what bacteria was. Now that you've got your edible container sorted out, you're probably wondering what exactly medieval people were putting inside them. Sure, you could store fresh food for a few days, but what happened when winter lasted 6 months and your turnip supply needed to last until spring? What did you do when you had a bumper crop of cabbage but no refrigeration? The answer is both disgusting and brilliant. You let it rot. On purpose, with scientific precision that would make modern microbiologists jealous. Welcome to the wild world of medieval fermentation, where controlled rotting was high art, and people routinely created complex bacterial ecosystems without having the faintest idea what bacteria actually were. They just knew that if you did certain things in certain ways, food would transform from fresh and boring into preserved and absolutely delicious. It was like medieval alchemy, except instead of trying to turn lead into gold, they were turning cabbage into superfoods. Let's start with sauerkraut, the fermented cabbage that became so essential to European survival that entire armies marched on their stomachs filled with the stuff. But medieval sauerkraut wasn't the pale, limp, vinegar-soaked disappointment you find in modern jars. This was bacterial warfare against hunger, scurvy, and food spoilage, waged with nothing but salt, time, and an understanding of fermentation that we're still trying to fully comprehend today. The process started simple enough. Medieval cooks would shred fresh cabbage, layer it with salt in specific ratios, and pack it into specialized containers. But here's where it gets interesting. They weren't just throwing salt and cabbage together and hoping for the best. Medieval fermentation was sophisticated chemistry disguised as cooking, with precise salt concentrations, specific container materials, and carefully controlled environments that modern scientists have found produce up to 28 different beneficial bacterial strains. Medieval fermentation techniques went far beyond simple sauerkraut, encompassing sophisticated systems that created multiple probiotic strains in a single batch. German households, in particular, developed what can only be described as fermentation laboratories in their basements, with multiple crocks running different processes simultaneously. They understood that different vegetables required different salt ratios, different temperatures, and different timing to achieve optimal results. The salt concentration was critical. Too little, and harmful bacteria would take over. Too much, and the beneficial fermentation bacteria couldn't survive. Medieval cooks figured out through trial and error that the sweet spot was usually around 2 to 3% salt by weight, creating an environment where good bacteria thrived while bad bacteria died. They didn't know about lactobacillus or pH levels, but they knew exactly how much salt to use for different vegetables based on centuries of accumulated wisdom. But salt wasn't the only player in this fermentation game. Medieval cooks developed complex herb combinations that modern research has shown to have antimicrobial properties that enhance the fermentation process. Caraway seeds, juniper berries, bay leaves, and dill weren't just flavor additions. They were natural preservatives that created hostile environments for harmful bacteria while encouraging beneficial fermentation. The containers themselves were engineering marvels. Medieval fermentation crocks were specifically designed with water seals that allowed carbon dioxide to escape while preventing oxygen from entering. These weren't accidental discoveries. They represent sophisticated understanding of anaerobic fermentation principles that we're still using today. The ceramic glazes were formulated to resist the acids produced during fermentation, and the shapes were optimized for proper fermentation temperatures and gas release. Now let's talk about verjuice, the medieval secret weapon that could replace expensive imported spices with locally produced flavor enhancement that was more complex and interesting than anything you could buy. Verjuice was made from unripe grapes, crab apples, or other sour fruits, pressed and fermented into a highly acidic liquid that could be stored for up to a year and provided incredible flavor enhancement without breaking the medieval household budget. The production process involved pressing unripe grapes before they developed sugar, creating an extremely tart and acidic liquid that was sometimes enhanced with herbs or salt. This technique produced a flavor enhancer similar to apple cider vinegar or white wine vinegar, but with a more complex, fruity profile that modern chefs are desperately trying to recreate. The key was timing. Harvest the fruit too early, and you wouldn't get enough juice. Too late, and the sugar content would interfere with the acid development. Medieval cooks used verjuice in ways that would revolutionize modern cooking if we weren't too stubborn to admit that medieval people knew what they were doing. They used it in stews and sauces for bright, acidic flavor that cut through rich meats and heavy grains. They mixed it with herbs for salad dressings that were more complex than anything you'll find in a modern supermarket. They used it as a marinade to tenderize tough cuts of meat, and they mixed it with honey to create sweet-sour flavor combinations that were centuries ahead of modern fusion cuisine. The technique represents sophisticated understanding of acid balance in cooking that modern cuisine has largely abandoned in favor of standardized vinegars and citrus acids. Verjuice provided layers of flavor that changed as it aged, developing complexity that single-ingredient acid sources simply can't match. Medieval cooks understood that different batches would have different characteristics based on the fruit varieties, harvest timing, and fermentation conditions, and they planned their cooking accordingly. But verjuice was just one example of medieval fermentation innovation. They also developed complex dairy fermentation systems that produced dozens of different cheese varieties, each with specific bacterial cultures that were maintained and passed down through generations. Medieval cheese makers didn't just make cheese. They were essentially managing bacterial ecosystems that required precise temperature control, humidity management, and timing that rivaled modern industrial processes. The innovation extended to beverages as well. Medieval ale was fundamentally different from modern beer because it relied on wild fermentation using naturally occurring yeasts and bacteria. This created complex flavor profiles that changed seasonally and regionally based on local microbial environments. Every household's ale had a unique character determined by their specific fermentation conditions and the bacterial cultures that had established themselves in their brewing equipment. Medieval households also fermented vegetables beyond cabbage. Turnips, beets, carrots, and even fruits were subjected to controlled fermentation that preserved them for months while enhancing their nutritional value. The fermentation process broke down tough plant fibers, making nutrients more bioavailable while creating beneficial bacteria that aided digestion. Modern research has confirmed that these fermented vegetables were often more nutritious than their fresh counterparts. The timing systems were remarkably sophisticated. Medieval fermentation schedules coordinated multiple processes to ensure continuous food availability throughout the year. Spring fermentation focused on early vegetables and dairy products from increased milk production. Summer fermentation prepared for winter storage while taking advantage of optimal temperatures. Fall fermentation processed the harvest surplus, and winter fermentation maintained active cultures during cold months when fresh food was scarce. Perhaps most impressively, medieval households developed quality control systems that ensured fermentation success without understanding the underlying science. They used sensory evaluation, smell, taste, appearance, and even sound to monitor fermentation progress and identify problems before they became dangerous. A properly fermenting sauerkraut crock had a specific sound when the gases bubbled through the water seal. Bad fermentation smelled different, looked different, and felt different to experienced practitioners. The social aspects of fermentation were equally important. Knowledge was passed down through generations of women who served as the household fermentation experts. These weren't written recipes, but learned skills that required understanding of timing, environmental conditions, and problem-solving that could only be developed through years of practice. The loss of this knowledge represents one of the greatest casualties of industrialization. Medieval fermentation also included emergency protocols for when things went wrong. If a batch developed off flavors or showed signs of harmful bacteria, there were specific remedies: additional salt, herb additions, temperature adjustments, or controlled re-fermentation that could often save the batch. These troubleshooting techniques represented accumulated wisdom from generations of fermentation experience. The environmental benefits were enormous. Fermentation allowed medieval households to preserve massive quantities of food using no external energy sources, no refrigeration, no chemical preservatives, no industrial processing. The process actually improved food safety by creating acidic environments hostile to harmful bacteria while maintaining nutritional value better than most modern preservation methods. When we abandoned traditional fermentation in favor of industrial food processing, we lost more than just techniques. We lost entire ecosystems of beneficial bacteria that had co-evolved with human digestive systems for thousands of years. Modern attempts to recreate these effects through probiotic supplements and fermented food products are essentially trying to rebuild what medieval households maintained automatically through their daily food preparation routines. The irony is that modern science has confirmed the effectiveness of medieval fermentation techniques, while simultaneously demonstrating how much more sophisticated they were than we realized. We're now paying premium prices for artisanal fermented foods that attempt to recreate what medieval people produced routinely in their own kitchens using techniques that were more advanced than most modern commercial fermentation processes. Medieval fermentation wasn't just food preservation, it was biotechnology. 4. Superfoods they threw away, when weeds were worth more than gold. So you've mastered the art of fermenting vegetables into bacterial powerhouses that would make your ancestors proud. You've got your sauerkraut bubbling, your verjuice aging, and your edible containers ready to store the bounty. But here's the thing that'll make you question everything you think you know about nutrition. The medieval people weren't just fermenting boring old cabbage and turnips. They were cultivating and consuming plants that were so nutritionally superior to our modern crops that it's almost criminal we abandon them. And the most insane part? Most of these nutritional powerhouses are literally growing as weeds in your backyard right now, while you're paying premium prices for imported superfoods that don't come close to their nutritional density. Welcome to the upside-down world of medieval nutrition, where the weeds your grandfather spent weekends trying to kill were actually more valuable than the crops we've spent centuries trying to perfect. We're talking about plants that could solve global malnutrition, survive climate change, and grow in conditions that would kill our pampered modern vegetables. But instead of cultivating these nutritional gold mines, we've relegated them to the compost heap while we obsess over exotic goji berries and acai that have to travel thousands of miles to reach our plates. Let's start with the most ridiculous example, chickweed. This innocent-looking little plant that sprouts up everywhere from garden beds to sidewalk cracks contains 7 times more vitamin C than oranges by weight. 7 times. While we're shipping citrus fruits across continents and paying premium prices for vitamin C supplements, there's a plant growing in virtually every temperate climate on Earth that makes oranges look like nutritional lightweights. Chickweed, Stellaria media, was so revered by medieval herbalists that they called it the royal provider of vitamin C, and for good reason. This hardy little plant grew prolifically in any soil, remained available year-round even in harsh climates, and provided accessible nutrition for all social classes. Medieval people didn't know what vitamin C was, but they sure knew that people who ate chickweed stayed healthier during the winter months when scurvy was claiming lives left and right. But the vitamin C content was just the beginning. Modern nutritional analysis has revealed that chickweed also contains significant amounts of calcium, magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, zinc, manganese, sodium, copper, iron, and vitamins A and D. It's essentially a multivitamin growing wild in your garden. And medieval people were harvesting it by the bushel while we're pulling it up and throwing it away. The most mind-bending part? Chickweed could theoretically address vitamin C deficiency globally today. It grows in virtually every climate, requires no cultivation, needs no fertilizers or pesticides, and produces continuously throughout the growing season. Yet it's now considered a garden pest rather than a valuable food source, which tells you everything you need to know about how divorced we've become from actual nutritional wisdom. Then there's Fat Hen, Chenopodium album, which served as medieval Europe's ultimate survival food and makes our modern emergency rations look like junk food. This remarkable plant was so critical during famines that it literally made the difference between life and death for entire populations. The seeds could be ground into flour, the leaves provided essential vitamins and minerals, and the plant grew in conditions that would kill most of our modern crops. Fat Hen thrived under adverse conditions that sent other plants into failure. Poor soil, drought, cold temperatures, and even salty conditions that would poison conventional vegetables. When the grain harvest failed and people were facing starvation, Fat Hen would still be growing strong, providing both emergency nutrition and hope for survival. Medieval people called it wild spinach, But that comparison doesn't do justice to its nutritional superiority. Modern research has confirmed what medieval people knew instinctively. Fat hen is nutritionally superior to most vegetables we currently cultivate. The leaves contain more protein than spinach, more vitamins A and C than most leafy greens, and the seeds provide complete protein with all essential amino acids. It's basically a superfood that grows wild, requires no maintenance, and produces massive yields under conditions that would destroy conventional agriculture. But here's where it gets really interesting. Fat hen was so valuable that medieval people actually cultivated it alongside their grain crops. They understood that this weed was insurance against crop failure and nutritional deficiency. When the barley and wheat crops were struggling, fat hen would be thriving, providing backup nutrition that could keep families alive through difficult seasons. The abandonment of fat hen represents one of agriculture's greatest mistakes. We've replaced a hardy, nutritious, climate-resilient plant with crops that require massive inputs of water, fertilizer, and pesticides while providing inferior nutrition. Modern climate change researchers are now looking at plants like fat hen as potential solutions for food security in an uncertain future, essentially rediscovering what medieval farmers never should have forgotten. And then there's skirret, Siam cicerum, a plant so valued by medieval nobility that King Henry IV maintained special gardens dedicated to its cultivation. This perennial root vegetable provided sweet, starchy roots with vanilla undertones that made it the medieval equivalent of a gourmet delicacy. But unlike modern delicacies that require extensive cultivation and perfect conditions, skirret thrived with minimal care and returned year after year like a gift from the gardening gods. Skirret was the ultimate sustainable crop. Plant it once, harvest it for decades. The roots could be harvested continuously without killing the plant, providing reliable nutrition year after year. During harsh winters when other crops failed, skirret roots could be dug from frozen ground to provide essential carbohydrates and nutrients. It was essentially a perennial insurance policy that medieval households could rely on regardless of weather conditions or agricultural disasters. The plant was so valuable that it appeared in the gardens of monasteries, castles, and even peasant households across Europe. Medieval garden manuals included detailed instructions for skirret cultivation, and recipes for preparing the roots appeared in the earliest cookbooks. It was considered both a staple food and a delicacy, providing reliable nutrition with flavors complex enough to satisfy sophisticated palates. But skirret's greatest advantage was its independence from annual cultivation cycles. While other crops required replanting, soil preparation, and constant attention, skirret established itself and continued producing for decades with minimal intervention. This represented enormous savings in labor, resources, and agricultural risk, exactly the kind of efficiency that modern sustainable agriculture is trying to achieve. So why did we abandon these nutritional powerhouses in favor of crops that require massive industrial support systems to produce inferior nutrition? The answer is depressingly predictable: appearance, convenience, and industrial agriculture's obsession with standardization over nutrition. Chickweed doesn't look impressive compared to perfectly shaped lettuce heads. Fat hen doesn't package and ship as well as spinach. Skirret doesn't produce the massive yields that industrial agriculture demands from annual crops. We chose visual appeal and industrial efficiency over nutritional density and environmental sustainability. The shift happened gradually during the Renaissance and accelerated with industrial agriculture. As food production moved from household gardens to commercial farms, plants that couldn't be easily mass-produced, transported, and stored were abandoned. The focus shifted from nutritional value to shelf life, from flavor complexity to visual uniformity, from sustainability to short-term profits. Medieval people understood something we've forgotten. The best foods are often the ones that don't require human improvement. Plants that have evolved to thrive in local conditions are usually more nutritious, more sustainable, and more resilient than crops that have been bred for commercial agriculture. The weeds that grow wild in your area are often more nutritionally dense than the vegetables you're buying at the grocery store. The irony is that modern nutritional science has confirmed the superiority of these medieval superfoods at exactly the moment when climate change and soil depletion are making industrial agriculture increasingly unsustainable. We're facing global food security challenges while some of the most nutritious and resilient plants on Earth are literally growing wild around us, ignored and undervalued. Contemporary foraging movements and permaculture advocates are essentially trying to rediscover the plant wisdom that medieval people maintained as common knowledge. Wild edibles guides, forage food restaurants, and sustainable agriculture programs are all attempting to rebuild the relationship with plants that was severed when we decided that newer was automatically better. The most frustrating part is that these plants are still available. They're just hiding in plain sight. Chickweed is probably growing in your yard right now. Fat hen is thriving in vacant lots and along roadsides. Skirret can still be found in specialty seed catalogs, though it requires patience and knowledge that most gardeners no longer possess. Medieval people didn't have access to global supply chains, chemical fertilizers, or greenhouse technology, but they had something more valuable: intimate knowledge of local plants and their nutritional properties. They understood that the best superfoods were often the ones that grew wild in their own backyards, providing superior nutrition without requiring industrial support systems. We've spent centuries trying to improve on perfection while ignoring the nutritional gold mines growing wild around us. Maybe it's time to admit that medieval people knew something about superfoods that we're only beginning to rediscover. 5. Storage genius. Keeping food fresh without electricity for years. So you've discovered that your backyard is actually a grocery store filled with nutritional powerhouses that put expensive imported superfoods to shame. You've foraged your chickweed, harvested your fat hen, and even managed to track down some skirret roots that taste like nature's candy. But now you're facing the same problem that stumped medieval people for centuries. How do you keep all this amazing food fresh when you don't have a refrigerator, freezer, or even a reliable source of ice? How do you store enough nutrition to survive a 6-month winter when your only preservation tools are salt, time, and human ingenuity? The answer will make you question everything you think you know about food storage. While we've become dependent on energy-guzzling appliances that break down, require constant maintenance, and fail spectacularly during power outages, medieval people created storage systems that maintained perfect conditions for years using nothing but clever architecture, physics, and an understanding of natural preservation that puts our modern methods to shame. Welcome to the world of medieval refrigeration, where underground chambers maintained more consistent temperatures than your modern fridge, where humidity was controlled without digital sensors, and where food storage systems were built to last centuries rather than decades. These weren't crude holes in the ground. They were architectural marvels that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics, air circulation, and environmental control that modern sustainable living enthusiasts are desperately trying to recreate. Let's start with root cellars, because calling them cellars is like calling the Sistine Chapel a painted ceiling. These underground storage chambers were engineering masterpieces that maintained optimal conditions for different food types, using principles that modern refrigeration technology is still trying to perfect. A properly designed medieval root cellar could keep vegetables fresh for 8 months, maintain consistent temperatures within a degree or two, and create humidity levels that prevented both drying and rot. The science behind these storage marvels was deceptively simple but brilliantly executed. Medieval builders understood that underground temperatures remained constant year-round, typically hovering around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 to 13 degrees Celsius, regardless of surface weather conditions. But they didn't just dig holes and hope for the best. They created sophisticated systems that controlled every aspect of the storage environment. Root cellars were dug 4+ feet deep to maintain consistent temperatures of 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 to 4 degrees Celsius, and 85 to 90% humidity, but the depth was just the beginning. The The walls were lined with stone or brick to provide thermal mass that absorbed temperature fluctuations and released stored coolness during warmer periods. The floors were often covered with sand or gravel to manage humidity levels and provide drainage that prevented standing water while maintaining optimal moisture levels. But here's where medieval engineering gets really impressive: the ventilation systems. These storage chambers featured sophisticated air circulation systems with intake and exhaust vents positioned to create continuous airflow that prevented mold growth without drying out stored foods. Cold air entered near the floor, circulated through the storage area, and exited through higher vents, creating constant gentle air movement that maintained perfect conditions. Archaeological excavations at medieval castle sites across Europe have revealed storage systems that put modern walk-in coolers to shame. Multiple interconnected chambers, each optimized for specific foods to prevent cross-contamination and maintain ideal conditions for different storage requirements. Some chambers were designed for root vegetables, others for grains, and still others for preserved meats and dairy products. The most sophisticated systems included suspended floors that provided air circulation underneath stored foods while protecting them from ground moisture and rodent intrusion. Wooden shelving systems created multiple storage levels that maximized space while ensuring proper air circulation around each item. Everything was designed to work together as an integrated system rather than just throwing food into an underground room and hoping it would stay fresh. Medieval storage architecture went far beyond simple root cellars to include specialized facilities for different preservation needs. Granaries were tower-like structures with raised floors and advanced ventilation systems that kept grain dry and pest-free for years. These weren't basic storage buildings. They were grain preservation laboratories that controlled moisture, temperature, and air circulation to maintain optimal conditions for long-term storage. The raised floor systems in granaries were particularly ingenious, using stone or wooden pillars to elevate the storage area above ground level. This prevented moisture wicking from the earth while creating air circulation space underneath that kept stored grain dry and well ventilated. The vertical design used natural convection to create airflow that prevented hot spots and moisture accumulation that could spoil entire harvests. Medieval builders also developed multiple silo systems that distributed storage risk across several containers. If one silo developed problems with rot, insects, or moisture, the others remained safe, protecting the household's entire grain supply from catastrophic loss. This redundancy principle is something modern industrial storage has largely abandoned in favor of massive, single point of failure systems. But perhaps the most impressive examples were the still houses, purpose-built structures that combine drying, smoking, and storage in single buildings optimized for northern European climates. These multi-function facilities use controlled fire heat to dry foods while simultaneously smoking meats and storing preserved foods in optimal conditions. The integration of multiple preservation techniques in single structures represents systems thinking that modern food preservation has largely forgotten. The still houses featured multiple chambers with different temperature and humidity zones created by careful positioning relative to heat sources and ventilation systems. Lower chambers provided cool, humid storage similar to root cellars. Middle chambers offered moderate temperatures for aging cheeses and cured meats. Upper chambers provided warm, dry conditions for grain storage and final drying of preserved foods. Temperature control in these facilities was achieved through thermal mass, strategic ventilation, and careful fire management rather than mechanical systems. Thick stone walls absorbed and released heat slowly, maintaining steady temperatures despite variations in external conditions. Adjustable vents allowed fine-tuning of airflow and humidity levels based on seasonal needs and storage requirements. Medieval storage systems also included specialized containers designed for specific foods and preservation methods. Ceramic crocks with glazed interiors were used for acidic fermentation and pickling, while different clay compositions were chosen based on their porosity and chemical properties. Wooden barrels were made from different wood types chosen for their compatibility with various preservation needs. Oak for wine and spirits, chestnut for grains, and pine for certain preserved foods. The organization systems were equally sophisticated, with detailed inventory management documented in surviving medieval manuscripts. Households maintained written records of what was stored where, when it was preserved, and expected storage life. Rotation systems based on first in first out principles ensured that older preserved foods were consumed before newer batches, minimizing waste and maintaining quality. Separation protocols prevented different foods from contaminating each other while optimizing storage conditions for each type. Strong-smelling foods were isolated to prevent flavor transfer. Foods with different humidity requirements were stored in separate areas. Items prone to pest problems were kept away from vulnerable stored goods. Everything was organized to maximize preservation success while minimizing cross-contamination risks. The humidity control in these systems was particularly remarkable given the lack of modern instruments. Medieval storage designers used combinations of materials and design features that naturally regulated moisture levels. Stone walls provided thermal mass and moisture buffering. Sand and gravel floors absorbed excess humidity while releasing moisture when conditions became too dry. Ventilation systems were positioned and sized to maintain optimal airflow without creating excessive drying. Archaeological evidence reveals storage systems that remained functional for centuries, with some medieval root cellars still maintaining proper temperatures and humidity levels after 500+ years of operation. These weren't temporary solutions, but permanent infrastructure designed to serve multiple generations of families. The construction quality and engineering sophistication rival modern commercial refrigeration facilities while using completely passive systems that require no external energy inputs. But we abandoned these proven storage systems in favor of electric refrigeration that requires constant energy input, regular maintenance, and complete replacement every 10 to 15 years. Modern refrigerators consume enormous amounts of electricity, contribute to climate change through refrigerant chemicals, and fail catastrophically during power outages that are becoming increasingly common due to extreme weather events. The irony is that medieval storage systems were more reliable, more sustainable, and often more effective than modern alternatives. Root cellars maintained more consistent temperatures than mechanical refrigerators, which cycle on and off, creating temperature fluctuations that accelerate food spoilage. Medieval storage systems had no moving parts to break down, required no external energy sources, and could operate indefinitely with minimal maintenance. Contemporary sustainable living advocates and off-grid homesteaders are now spending thousands of dollars trying to recreate storage systems that medieval people built routinely using local materials and traditional techniques. Modern root cellar construction requires specialized knowledge and materials that cost more than multiple high-end refrigerators, while achieving results that medieval people accomplished using basic tools and accumulated wisdom. The abandonment of traditional storage represents one of the most costly mistakes of industrial development. We traded proven, sustainable, long-term solutions for convenient but fragile technology that requires constant resource inputs and regular replacement. Medieval storage systems were designed for permanence. Modern alternatives are designed for obsolescence. Maybe it's time to admit that keeping food fresh without electricity isn't a step backward, but a step toward true sustainability. 6. Stone soup and portable kitchens. Cooking when you had no pots. All right, so you've built yourself an underground storage empire that would make modern preppers weep with envy. Your root cellar is maintaining perfect temperatures. Your grain silos are keeping harvests fresh for years, and your still house is drying, smoking, and storing food with mechanical precision that puts industrial facilities to shame. But now you're facing a new problem that medieval people knew all too well. What happens when you need to cook, but you don't actually own any cookware? Maybe you're a traveling merchant whose metal pot just cracked 2 days into a month-long journey. Maybe you're a peasant whose family owns exactly one cooking vessel, and it's currently being used for the perpetual stew that can't be interrupted. Or maybe you're just tired of being limited by whatever metal cookware you can afford when there are perfectly good rocks lying around that could do the job better. Welcome to the ingenious world of medieval cooking hacks, where hot stones became portable stoves, gear systems turned dinner automatically, and kitchen gadgets were so cleverly designed that modern engineers are still trying to figure out how they worked. This is where medieval ingenuity really shines, because when you can't rely on having the right equipment, you learn to make any equipment work. And medieval people didn't just make do. They created cooking systems that were more versatile, more portable, and often more effective than the fancy cookware we think we need today. Let's start with stone boiling, because if you've never seen someone cook soup using red-hot rocks, you haven't lived. This technique sounds primitive until you realize it's actually sophisticated heat transfer technology that allowed medieval people to boil water and cook meals using nothing but stones, fire, and containers that couldn't withstand direct heat. The process was elegantly simple, but required skill and timing that took years to master. Medieval cooks would select specific types of stones, usually granite or other dense, non-porous rocks that wouldn't crack or explode when heated to extreme temperatures. These stones were heated in a fire until they glowed red-hot, then carefully transferred using wooden tongs or specialized tools into water-filled containers made for baskets, wooden bowls, leather bags, or even hollowed-out gourds. When metal cookware was scarce or expensive, stone boiling provided portable cooking capability that could work anywhere you could build a fire and find suitable rocks. The heated stones brought water to near-boiling temperatures within minutes and could be replaced as they cooled to maintain cooking temperature for extended periods. This technique was particularly valuable for communities without access to metal cookware and provided cooking solutions for travel, temporary settlements, or situations where traditional cooking methods weren't available. But here's where it gets really impressive. Skilled practitioners could control cooking temperatures by using different sized stones, varying the number of stones used and timing their replacement to maintain precise heat levels. Small stones provided gentle simmering, while large stones created rapid boiling. Multiple stones could maintain consistent temperatures for hours, allowing complex cooking processes that rivaled conventional pot cooking. The technique wasn't limited to simple boiling either. Medieval cooks used heated stones for steaming by adding them to water in closed containers, roasting by surrounding food with hot stones, and even baking by creating stone-lined cooking chambers. Archaeological evidence from medieval campsites shows specialized stone-lined pits designed for different cooking methods, representing sophisticated understanding of heat management and food preparation. Stone boiling also solved practical problems that modern camping equipment still struggles with. Waterproof leather bags could be used as cooking vessels when filled with water and heated stones, creating portable cookware that weighed almost nothing and never broke. Baskets lined with pitch or clay became temporary cooking pots that could be discarded after use. Even cloth bags could serve as cooking vessels when used carefully with appropriately sized stones. But medieval ingenuity didn't stop with portable solutions. They also created permanent cooking systems that put modern kitchens to shame. The most impressive examples were the mechanical systems that cooked food automatically using nothing but clever engineering and the power of heat differentials. Medieval kitchens featured surprisingly sophisticated mechanical systems for even cooking that operated without human intervention for hours at a time. Gear systems turned spits automatically using the power of rising heated air, eliminating the need for servants to stand by fires manually rotating heavy pieces of meat. These systems used turbine-like wheels positioned in chimneys that captured the flow of hot air and converted it into rotational power that could turn multiple spits simultaneously. The engineering was remarkably sophisticated. Counterweight systems maintained consistent spit rotation regardless of the meat's weight distribution as it cooked and lost moisture. Adjustable pulley systems allowed cooks to move pots closer to or farther from fires for precise temperature control. Some facilities used large wheels that kitchen workers could walk inside, like human-powered hamster wheels, to power multiple cooking processes simultaneously. The most advanced medieval kitchens included adjustable cooking height systems that provided precise heat control without temperature gauges or modern measuring instruments. Tripods with adjustable legs could position cooking vessels at exact distances from heat sources. Chain and pulley systems allowed quick raising or lowering of pots during cooking. Specialized trivets and stands accommodated different pot sizes and cooking requirements while maintaining optimal heat exposure. These mechanical systems weren't crude contraptions, but sophisticated machines that demonstrate advanced understanding of physics, engineering, and heat management. Some medieval castle kitchens featured gear systems so complex that they required specialized maintenance and operators who understood the mechanical principles involved. The systems were built to last centuries and often operated continuously for decades without significant repairs. Medieval heat management achieved precise temperature control using techniques that modern cooks are only beginning to rediscover. Without thermometers, medieval cooks developed sophisticated methods for gauging and controlling cooking temperatures using visual cues, timing, and positioning that were often more accurate than modern digital instruments. Fire management was a highly developed skill that included maintaining different heat zones within single cooking areas. Medieval hearths featured multiple fire levels: high heat for searing, medium heat for roasting, and low heat for slow cooking, all managed simultaneously in integrated systems. Adjustable andirons allowed fine-tuning of fire intensity and heat distribution. Specialized fuel management using different wood types created specific heat characteristics and flavor profiles. The positioning systems were particularly clever. Medieval cooks used adjustable pot hangers that could move cooking vessels through different heat zones during the cooking process. Swing arm systems allowed quick movement of pots between different fire positions. Specialized hooks and chains provided precise height adjustment for optimal heat exposure. Everything was designed to give cooks complete control over cooking conditions using mechanical systems rather than electronic controls. Medieval kitchen tools were also far more sophisticated than commonly assumed, representing advanced understanding of mechanical principles and material science that modern kitchen gadget manufacturers are still trying to replicate. The mortar and pestle served as the universal food processor, available in multiple sizes from tiny spice grinders to massive mortars requiring 2 people to operate. These tools featured specialized materials chosen for specific purposes: stone for grinding grains and spices, metal for tough materials, and wood for delicate items that could be damaged by harder surfaces. The mortars were precisely shaped to optimize grinding efficiency, with interior surfaces textured to enhance grinding action while preventing ingredients from escaping during use. Medieval kitchens featured comprehensive straining and processing equipment that included fine mesh cloths for creating smooth sauces and purees, perforated spoons in multiple sizes for different foods, metal graters with both fine and coarse surfaces, and specialized cheesecloth for straining, wrapping, and forming various food products. Each tool was designed for specific tasks and optimized for efficiency and durability. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of medieval cooking systems was their integration. Everything worked together as coordinated systems rather than individual tools. Fire management, mechanical systems, and tool design all supported each other to create cooking environments that could handle complex meal preparation for large groups using renewable energy sources and sustainable materials. The portable applications were equally remarkable. Medieval armies developed field cooking systems that could feed thousands of soldiers using portable equipment that modern military logistics still envies. Collapsible cooking stands, portable fire management systems, and modular cooking equipment allowed complete meal preparation in temporary camps using local materials and minimal transportation requirements. Traveling merchants and pilgrims used personal cooking kits that weighed almost nothing but could prepare complete meals anywhere they could find fuel and water. These systems included collapsible vessels, portable fire starters, and multi-purpose tools that served cooking, eating, and storage functions simultaneously. The abandonment of these techniques represents a massive loss of practical knowledge and sustainable technology. Modern cooking has become dependent on complex appliances that require constant electricity, break frequently, and become obsolete within years. Medieval cooking systems were designed for permanence, sustainability, and independence from industrial infrastructure. Contemporary off-grid living advocates and traditional skills enthusiasts are now paying experts to teach them techniques that were once common knowledge among medieval people. Bushcraft schools charge hundreds of dollars to teach stone boiling methods that medieval children learned as basic life skills. The irony is that these medieval cooking techniques often produce better results than modern alternatives. Stone-cooked foods develop unique flavors and textures that conventional cooking can't replicate. Mechanical spit systems provide more even cooking than electric rotisseries. Medieval heat management techniques offer more precise control than many modern cooking methods. We traded versatile, sustainable, reliable cooking systems for convenient but fragile technology that fails when we need it most. Medieval cooking worked anywhere, anytime, using materials that were freely available and techniques that lasted lifetimes. Maybe it's time to remember that the best kitchen gadgets are the ones that never need batteries. 7. Zero waste mastery. Using every part of everything. So you've mastered the art of cooking with red-hot rocks and automatic spit-turning mechanisms that would make modern engineers jealous. You can boil water in a leather bag, roast meat using nothing but heated stones, and operate kitchen gadgets so sophisticated they require mechanical expertise to maintain. But now comes the real test of medieval genius. What do you do with all the leftover bits? The bones, the scraps, the parts that modern people automatically throw in the garbage without a second thought. Here's where you're about to discover that medieval people didn't just avoid waste. They treated it like a criminal offense punishable by social shame, economic ruin, and sometimes actual legal consequences. We're talking about a society that achieved something close to true zero waste centuries before the term was invented. Not because they were trying to save the planet, but because throwing away perfectly good materials was basically economic suicide in a world where everything had value and nothing was replaceable. Welcome to medieval waste management, where just about every part of the pig was eaten, including ears, snout, tail, tongue, and womb, where animal bones became smartphones, medieval edition, and where throwing away food scraps was considered almost as wasteful as burning money. This wasn't hippie environmentalism or trendy sustainability. This was hardcore economic efficiency that would make modern zero-waste advocates look like wasteful amateurs. Let's start with the pig, because medieval pig utilization was so complete and so ingenious that it makes our modern nose-to-tail cooking movement look like a cute hobby. When medieval people slaughtered a pig, they didn't just get pork chops and bacon. They got an entire industrial supply chain's worth of materials that provided food, tools, containers, and household goods that could last for years. Medieval complete pig utilization was legendary in its thoroughness. The meat was obviously eaten fresh, salted, smoked, or turned into sausages that could last for months. But that was just the beginning. The blood became black pudding, blood sausage, and protein-rich additions to bread and stews. The fat was rendered into lard for cooking, soap making, and lamp fuel that provided light during long winter nights. The organs weren't waste products. They were delicacies and essential nutrition sources. Liver provided concentrated vitamins and minerals that were scarce in medieval diets. Kidneys were prized for their unique flavors and nutritional density. Hearts became specialty dishes for important occasions. Even the reproductive organs were consumed, providing proteins and nutrients that weren't available from other sources. But here's where medieval ingenuity really shines. They used parts of the pig that modern people don't even know exist. The ears became gelatinous treats that provided essential collagen. The tail was considered a delicacy that required special cooking techniques. The tongue was a prized cut that appeared at noble tables. The intestines became sausage casings that allowed preservation of meat mixtures for extended periods. Even the non-food parts had essential uses that made the pig a complete household supply store. The hide became leather for clothing, shoes, bags, and countless other necessities. The bristles were collected for brush making, cleaning tools, and even textile applications. The bones were processed into tools, utensils, game pieces, and decorative items that served households for generations. The bladder became a natural balloon and storage container for liquids and small items. The hooves were boiled down for glue that was stronger and more reliable than many modern adhesives. The stomach lining was used as a natural membrane for various applications. Literally nothing was discarded. Everything had value and multiple potential uses. This complete utilization wasn't just about food, but about economic survival. Pigs could be fed organic waste from households, making them ideal for converting scraps into valuable products while providing maximum nutrition return on minimal investment. The system was so efficient that pigs essentially became waste recycling centers that produced valuable outputs from materials that would otherwise be discarded. Medieval bone and antler utilization represents another level of waste reduction sophistication that puts modern recycling to shame. Archaeological evidence reveals that medieval craftspeople created an astounding variety of useful items from animal bones that would otherwise be thrown away: combs, needles, dice, gaming pieces, knife handles, weaving tools, buttons, and countless other household necessities. The bone processing techniques were remarkably advanced, using natural methods that modern manufacturers are only beginning to rediscover. Bones are cleaned using forest insects, ants, or controlled burial that allowed natural cleaning without chemical processing. The clean bones were then carefully shaped using axes, filing, and chiseling techniques that required specialized skills and tools. Professional bone workers developed complex techniques that maximized the useful material from each bone while creating products that were often superior to modern alternatives. They understood that only the outside of antlers could be used for fine work. The inside was too spongy, required careful bone seasoning to prevent cracking, and used specialized tools that eliminated the need for polishing while achieving smooth, finished surfaces. Medieval bone craftspeople created elaborate decorated items, including reliquary caskets, demonstrating that waste utilization could produce valuable finished goods that serve both practical and artistic purposes. Gaming pieces, decorative combs, and ceremonial items showed that bones weren't just utilitarian materials, but could be transformed into luxury goods that rivaled expensive imported materials. The economic impact was enormous. Professional bone workers supplied entire communities with essential tools and household items using materials that modern society discards without thought. This represented significant value creation from waste streams, while providing employment and essential goods that supported medieval economic systems. But medieval waste reduction extended far beyond animal products to include comprehensive systems for utilizing every scrap of plant material, food waste, and household byproducts. Medieval households developed sophisticated composting systems that converted organic waste into valuable soil amendments that improved crop yields and soil fertility. Kitchen scraps weren't garbage. They were pig food, compost materials, or ingredients for secondary food products that extracted additional nutrition from materials that might otherwise be discarded. Vegetable peels were often more nutritious than the vegetables themselves, providing concentrated vitamins and minerals that were essential for medieval diets. Bread crusts and stale bread became foundations for other dishes rather than waste products. Medieval cooks developed dozens of recipes specifically designed to use bread that was past its prime, transforming it into puddings, stuffings, thickeners for stews, and bases for sweet and savory dishes that were often more nutritious and flavorful than fresh bread preparations. Even food preparation byproducts had value. Whey from cheese making became drink, pig food, an ingredient for secondary cheese products. Grain hulls from processing were used as animal feed, insulation material, and even as components in building construction. Fruit pomace from pressing was dried and used as animal feed or processed into secondary products that extracted additional value from the original fruit. The legal and social frameworks around waste reflect how seriously medieval society took resource conservation. Many medieval towns had laws against throwing food waste in streets or waterways, not primarily for sanitation, but because edible materials were too valuable to discard carelessly. Wasting food was often subject to fines or social penalties that reflected the economic value of discarded materials. Guild regulations for butchers, bakers, and other food-related trades included specific requirements for proper utilization of byproducts and waste materials. Professional food workers were expected to demonstrate efficient use of materials, and wasteful practices could result in guild penalties, lost licenses, or exclusion from professional organizations. The social pressure against waste was enormous because everyone understood that one person's waste could be another's essential materials. Neighbors watched each other's resource use, and wasteful households faced social disapproval that could affect their standing in the community. This wasn't government regulation, but community-enforced efficiency that made waste socially unacceptable. Medieval textile waste reduction was equally impressive, with clothing and fabric scraps being systematically reused, repurposed, and recycled through multiple generations. Worn clothing was cut up for patches, children's clothing, cleaning rags, and eventually composted when no other use remained. Even the smallest fabric scraps had value for patching, stuffing, or other household applications. The economic logic was inescapable. In a world where everything was expensive and difficult to replace, waste represented direct economic loss that households couldn't afford. A discarded food scrap could have fed animals that provided meat, milk, or eggs. A thrown-away bone could have become a tool that lasted for years. Wasted fabric could have provided material for essential repairs or children's clothing. Modern waste streams would have horrified medieval people, not because of environmental concerns, but because of the economic insanity of discarding valuable materials. The average American household throws away over 1,000 pounds of organic waste annually, materials that medieval households would have converted into animal feed, compost, and secondary food products worth significant money. Contemporary zero-waste movements are essentially trying to recreate the resource efficiency that medieval households maintained automatically through economic necessity and social pressure. Modern upcycling and waste reduction techniques often rediscover practices that were standard knowledge among medieval people who couldn't afford the luxury of waste. The irony is that our modern disposal economy has made us less efficient and more wasteful than people who lived centuries ago without industrial technology. We've created systems that prioritize convenience over efficiency, generating massive waste streams that represent enormous economic and environmental costs. Medieval waste reduction wasn't just about being thrifty. It was about understanding that everything has value if you know how to use it. They didn't see waste and garbage. They saw unused resources and unrealized potential. Every scrap, every bone, every leftover bit was an opportunity to create value rather than a problem to be disposed of. Maybe it's time to stop thinking like consumers and start thinking like medieval craftspeople who saw possibility where we see garbage. 8. Medieval fast food, street vendors, and instant meals. So you become a master of medieval zero waste, turning pig bones into kitchen utensils and bread crusts into gourmet meals while making modern recycling programs look like amateur hour. You've learned to see opportunity where others see garbage, and you've discovered that medieval people squeeze value from every scrap, every leftover, every supposedly useless bit until nothing remained but perfectly utilized resources. But here's the thing that'll really blow your mind. All this incredible efficiency wasn't just happening in home kitchens run by thrifty housewives. It was also powering a thriving commercial food industry that put modern fast food to shame. That's right. Medieval Europe had a bustling fast food culture that would make McDonald's executives weep with envy. We're talking about hot food available 24/7, street vendors with mobile cooking units, and grab-and-go meals that fed entire urban populations centuries before anyone invented the drive-thru. And the best part? The food was actually good, made from real ingredients, and served by people who understood that quick didn't have to mean terrible. Welcome to the original fast food revolution, where cookshops served as medieval restaurants, portable ovens rolled through city streets like food trucks, and you could get a hot, delicious, filling meal faster than you can get a burger today. This wasn't some primitive attempt at convenience food. This was a sophisticated commercial food system that fed millions of people while maintaining quality, variety, and flavor that modern fast food can't touch. Let's start with cook shops because these establishments were basically the medieval equivalent of restaurants, except they were better organized, more efficient, and served food that was actually nutritious. Cook shops were found in every major city and clustered on dedicated streets that were literally called Cook Street or Cook's Lane. Entire districts devoted to commercial food preparation that operated around the clock to serve urban populations. Many cook shops operated 24 hours a day, especially near ports and city gates where they could capture foot traffic from travelers, merchants, sailors, and workers who needed meals at all hours. These weren't casual operations run by amateurs. They were professional food service establishments with specialized equipment, trained staff, and business models that would impress modern restaurant consultants. The most popular convenience foods were meat pies and pasties, portable, self-contained meals that came with their own edible or disposable containers. Remember those coffin crusts we talked about earlier? Well, cook shops turned that technology into a fast food empire, creating grab-and-go meals that could be eaten hot from vendors or stored for travel without any additional packaging. These weren't just simple meat and pastry combinations, but sophisticated meals that provided complete nutrition in portable form. Medieval pie makers developed dozens of different varieties: meat pies with vegetables and grains, fish pies for fast days, sweet fruit pies for dessert, and even vegetarian options made with cheese, eggs, and seasonal vegetables. Each pie was essentially a complete meal that could feed a working person for hours while providing balanced nutrition. The crust technology was particularly ingenious because it solved multiple problems simultaneously. Hard flour and water crusts served as disposable containers that protected the food during transport, provided portion control, and could be discarded after eating the contents. These thick, utilitarian crusts weren't meant to be eaten. They were medieval takeout containers that happened to be made of bread. But for customers who could afford premium options, cook shops also offered soft, edible crusts that were designed to be consumed as part of the meal. These represented the difference between fast food and fine dining. Both served the same basic function, but with very different expectations for quality and presentation. Medieval vendors used portable ovens on wheels to sell hot pies directly on streets. The original food trucks that provided hot meals to urban workers who lived in cramped conditions without kitchens. These mobile cooking units were remarkably sophisticated, featuring insulated chambers that maintained consistent temperatures, adjustable vents for heat control, and wheels that allowed vendors to move their operations to wherever customers were located. The portable ovens weren't just simple warming boxes, but actual cooking equipment that could bake fresh pies throughout the day. Vendors would start with partially cooked pies that could be finished quickly in their mobile ovens, ensuring that customers always received hot, fresh food rather than reheated leftovers. The timing and logistics required to maintain this system demonstrate remarkable operational sophistication. Street vendors also sold a variety of other quick foods that served different needs and budgets. Hard-cooked eggs provided cheap, portable protein that could be eaten immediately or carried for later consumption. Preserved sausages offered concentrated nutrition that didn't require heating or preparation. Nuts and dried fruits provided energy-dense snacks that could sustain workers through long days of physical labor. The bread vendors were particularly important because bread was the primary staple that was consumed at rates of 1 to 15 kilograms per person daily. Different quality breads were available for different social classes and economic levels. White bread for the wealthy, brown bread for the middle classes, and coarse dark bread for the poor. But even the cheapest bread was nutritious and filling, providing essential carbohydrates and nutrients that sustained medieval urban populations. This convenience food system served crucial social and economic functions that modern fast food chains are still trying to replicate. Urban workers who lived in single rooms without cooking facilities could access hot, nutritious meals without needing their own kitchens. Travelers could purchase complete meals that would sustain them for days of journey. Households could provide emergency hosting for unexpected guests without the time and expense of cooking from scratch. The quality control in medieval fast food was often superior to modern alternatives because professional guild systems enforced standards that protected both vendors and customers. Pie makers belonged to professional organizations that regulated ingredients, cooking methods, and business practices. Poor quality products could result in guild penalties, lost licenses, or exclusion from lucrative market locations. Medieval fast food also achieved something that modern chains struggle with: local adaptation and seasonal variety. Street vendors used local ingredients and adapted their offerings based on seasonal availability, regional preferences, and local food traditions. This meant that fast food in different cities had distinct characteristics and flavors rather than the standardized uniformity that characterizes modern chains. The pricing structures accommodated different economic levels while maintaining profitability for vendors. Basic meat pies provided affordable nutrition for working people, while premium versions with better ingredients and edible crusts served wealthier customers. Portion sizes varied to match different appetites and budgets, and vendors often offered combination deals that provided better value for regular customers. Medieval cookshops also developed what we would now call catering services, providing large quantities of prepared food for special events, guild meetings, and religious celebrations. These operations could scale up to feed hundreds of people while maintaining quality and coordination that impressed contemporary observers and modern food historians. The logistics behind medieval fast food were remarkably sophisticated. Cookshops required reliable supply chains for ingredients, fuel management for continuous cooking operations, waste disposal systems that complied with urban regulations, and coordination with other vendors to avoid conflicts over prime selling locations. The successful operations were essentially small businesses that managed complex supply chains and customer service operations. Urban authorities recognized the importance of fast food vendors and developed regulations that protected both vendors and customers while maintaining public order. Market regulations specified where vendors could operate, what foods they could sell, and how they should conduct business. These weren't arbitrary restrictions, but carefully designed systems that balance commercial interests with public welfare. The social aspects of medieval fast food created community gathering places that served functions beyond simple food service. Cookshops became informal social centers where people exchanged news, conducted business, and maintained social connections. Street food vendors provided focal points for neighborhood activity and community interaction that strengthened urban social networks. Medieval fast food also demonstrated remarkable innovation in packaging and presentation that anticipated modern food service techniques. Individual serving containers, portable utensils, and even primitive napkins, usually bread crusts, provided complete dining solutions that required no additional equipment or preparation for customers. The variety available in medieval cities would surprise modern fast food customers accustomed to limited menus and standardized offerings. Different vendors specialized in different foods: pie makers, bread bakers, sausage sellers, cheese vendors, fruit sellers, and beverage merchants created diverse food ecosystems that provided comprehensive nutrition and meal options for every taste and budget. Medieval fast food succeeded because it solved real problems for real people rather than creating artificial convenience. Urban workers genuinely needed quick, affordable, nutritious meals that they could eat without interrupting their work schedules. Travelers actually required portable food that wouldn't spoil during long journeys. Households really did need emergency meal solutions for unexpected situations. The decline of medieval fast food came with changes in urban living patterns. The rise of home cooking facilitated by better kitchen technology, and eventually the industrialization of food production that prioritized mass production over local adaptation and quality. But modern fast food chains are essentially trying to recreate the convenience and accessibility that medieval cookshops provided naturally through their business models and community integration. The difference is that medieval fast food achieved convenience without sacrificing nutrition, quality, or local character. Contemporary food trucks, artisanal fast food, and local food movements are all attempting to recapture elements of the medieval fast food experience: quality ingredients, local sourcing, community connection, and food that's both convenient and genuinely good. Medieval people understood that fast food didn't have to mean bad food, and that convenience could coexist with quality, nutrition, and flavor. They created a commercial food system that fed entire urban populations while maintaining standards that modern fast food is still trying to achieve. Maybe it's time to admit that the original fast food revolution got it right the first time. 9. Brewing without hops, getting drunk on weeds and flowers. So you've discovered that medieval cities had better fast food than most modern urban centers, complete with 24/7 cookshops, mobile food trucks, and grab-and-go meals that put contemporary convenience food to shame. You've learned that street vendors were feeding entire populations with hot, fresh, nutritious food using business models that would make modern restaurant chains jealous. But here's the thing. All that delicious medieval fast food needed something to wash it down, and medieval people weren't sipping water with their meat pies for reasons that should be obvious if you remember our earlier discussion about what passed for clean water in the 14th century. No, medieval people were drinking beer. Lots of beer. Beer for breakfast, beer for lunch, beer for dinner, and beer for that midnight snack when the perpetual stew called your name. Children drank beer. Monks drank beer. Even the animals got beer sometimes when the humans were feeling generous. But here's the part that'll twist your brain into a pretzel. Medieval beer was nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, like the beer you're drinking today. Welcome to the wonderful world of medieval brewing, where hops were basically unknown, where Alesh were flavored with mysterious herb mixtures that could get you drunk and possibly cure your diseases at the same time, and where brewing was such serious business that entire communities depended on it for survival. This wasn't just about getting tipsy after a hard day of avoiding the plague. This was sophisticated biochemistry disguised as weekend hobby brewing, creating beverages that were safer than water, more nutritious than most food, and psychoactive in ways that modern beer can't touch. Let's start with the obvious question. If medieval beer didn't use hops, what the hell was in it? The answer is gruit, complex herb mixtures that were closely guarded trade secrets, passed down through generations of brewers like family heirlooms, and regulated by authorities who understood that controlling the beer supply was basically controlling the population's mood, health, and loyalty. Gruit was a blend of herbs, spices, and other botanicals that provided everything hops do in modern beer: preservation, flavoring, and bitterness to balance the sweetness of malted grains, plus a whole lot more that hops can't deliver. We're talking about herb combinations that included bog myrtle, yarrow, juniper, wild rosemary, sage, and dozens of other plants that created flavor profiles ranging from piney and resinous to floral and medicinal. But gruit wasn't just about flavor. These herb blends provided natural preservation through antimicrobial compounds that kept beer fresh for months without refrigeration. Many gruit herbs contained compounds that were mildly psychoactive, creating intoxicating effects that were different from simple alcohol. More complex, longer-lasting, and often described as more euphoric than modern beer drunk. Medieval brewers developed sophisticated grain combinations that demonstrated advanced understanding of brewing chemistry centuries before anyone knew what enzymes were. The traditional process used 60 to 70% oats, 10 to 20% malted wheat, and 15 to 25% malted barley in carefully calculated ratios that provided optimal fermentation conditions and nutritional content. Here's where it gets really clever. Since oats couldn't be malted, they don't contain the right enzymes. Medieval brewers mixed unmalted oats with malted grains to provide the necessary enzymes for converting starches into fermentable sugars. This technique demonstrates advanced understanding of brewing biochemistry that modern craft brewers are only beginning to rediscover. The brewing process itself was fundamentally different from modern methods. Medieval ale used unboiled brewing processes that preserved beneficial bacteria and enzymes while creating unique flavors and nutritional profiles. Instead of boiling the wort, liquid extracted from grains, like modern brewing, medieval brewers used hot, but not boiling water mixed with crushed malt to create a fermentable liquid that retained living enzymes and beneficial microorganisms. This unboiled brewing created alesh that were essentially liquid probiotics, fermented beverages that contained beneficial bacteria that aided digestion and provided nutrients that weren't available from other sources. The fermentation was either spontaneous, using wild yeast from the environment, or used saved yeast from previous batches, creating continuous fermentation cultures that developed unique characteristics over time. The Grut brewing system provided natural preservation that was often more effective than modern hop preservation. Bog myrtle, one of the most common Grut ingredients, contains compounds that are powerfully antimicrobial and can preserve beer for longer periods than hops, while providing complex flavors that change and develop as the beer ages. Yarrow adds bitter compounds and preservation properties while contributing herbal notes that complement rather than dominate the grain flavors. Juniper berries were particularly prized because they provided both preservation and distinctive pine-like flavors that made Alesh taste like liquid forests. Wild rosemary added aromatic compounds that enhanced the drinking experience while providing medicinal benefits that medieval people valued as much as the intoxicating effects. Some Grut blends included sage, which provided antimicrobial properties and subtle herbal flavors that created sophisticated taste profiles. But medieval brewing went far beyond simple ale to include an entire ecosystem of fermented beverages that served different purposes and provided various levels of alcohol, nutrition, and medicinal benefits. Braggot was a hybrid drink that combined fermented ale with honey, creating beverages that were stronger than ale but more complex than mead, often flavored with spices and herbs that provided additional preservation and psychoactive effects. Metheglin was honey mead enhanced with herbs specifically chosen for medicinal properties. Different metheglin recipes targeted different health issues, digestive problems, respiratory ailments, joint pain, and even mental health issues that medieval people treated with carefully formulated herbal alcohol preparations. These weren't just drinks, but liquid medicines that provided both treatment and pleasure in single beverages. Medieval brewers also created various fruit wines using local ingredients and traditional fermentation techniques that captured seasonal flavors while providing preserved nutrition throughout the year. Apple wine, pear wine, berry wines, and even vegetable wines provided variety and nutrition that supplemented grain-based Alesh during different seasons and harvest periods. All of these fermented beverages served as safer alternatives to questionable water sources while providing essential calories, vitamins, and minerals that weren't readily available from other foods. Medieval ale contained B vitamins from the fermentation process, minerals from the grains, and beneficial bacteria that supported digestive health. For populations living on limited diets, beer wasn't just a beverage, but an essential nutritional supplement. The alcohol content was carefully managed to provide preservation and mild intoxication without rendering people incapable of work. Most medieval Alesh contained 2 to 4% alcohol, enough to kill harmful bacteria and provide mood enhancement, but low enough that people could drink it throughout the day without becoming seriously impaired. This was session drinking perfected centuries before anyone used that term. Medieval brewing was also deeply integrated into agricultural and economic systems in ways that modern commercial brewing has completely abandoned. Brewing used grains that were specifically grown and processed for fermentation, creating agricultural cycles that coordinated farming, malting, and brewing throughout the year. Spent grains from brewing became animal feed that supported livestock production, creating closed-loop systems that minimized waste while maximizing nutrition. The social and economic importance of brewing meant that ale quality was heavily regulated by authorities who understood that bad beer could destabilize entire communities. The Assize of Bread and Ale, 1266, in London regulated both bread and beer quality, with specific penalties for brewers who produced inferior products or used substandard ingredients. Guild systems enforced brewing standards and protected both brewers and consumers from fraud and poor quality products. Professional brewers developed sophisticated quality control methods that relied on sensory evaluation, traditional knowledge, and testing techniques that were often more reliable than modern industrial brewing quality control. They understood how different ingredients affected fermentation, how environmental conditions influence flavor development, and how storage and serving conditions affected the final product. Medieval brewing also included seasonal variations that reflected agricultural cycles and ingredient availability. Spring Alesh used early herbs and flowers. Summer Alesh incorporated seasonal fruits and vegetables. Autumn Alesh featured harvest grains and preservation herbs. And winter Alesh used stored ingredients and warming spices that provided comfort during cold months. The decline of grit brewing came with the rise of hop cultivation and the standardization that hops provided for commercial brewing operations. Hops were easier to grow, store, and standardize than complex herb mixtures, making them more suitable for large-scale commercial brewing that prioritized consistency over complexity. But we lost something important when we abandoned grit brewing. The complex herb blends provided flavors, aromas, and effects that modern beer simply can't replicate. The nutritional benefits of unboiled brewing and beneficial bacteria were sacrificed for industrial efficiency and longer shelf life. The local adaptation and seasonal variation that made each region's beer unique disappeared in favor of standardized products that taste the same everywhere. Contemporary craft brewing movements are now desperately trying to recreate grit Alesh and traditional brewing techniques, but they're essentially rediscovering knowledge that was once common among medieval brewers. Modern wild fermentation and farmhouse Alesh attempt to capture the complexity and local character that medieval brewing achieved naturally through traditional methods and local ingredients. The irony is that medieval brewing was more sustainable, more nutritious, and often more flavorful than modern industrial beer production. Medieval brewers used local ingredients, created zero waste, supported local agriculture, and produced beverages that contributed to public health rather than just providing empty calories and alcohol. Medieval people understood that brewing wasn't just about getting drunk. It was about creating safe, nutritious, delicious beverages that enhanced life rather than just providing temporary escape from it. They developed brewing systems that were more sophisticated, more sustainable, and more beneficial than most of what replaced them. Maybe it's time to admit that getting drunk on weeds and flowers was actually a better idea than we thought. 10. Food safety without science. Staying alive when everything was trying to kill you. So you've discovered that medieval people were getting safely drunk on complex herbal brews that were more nutritious, more flavorful, and more sophisticated than anything modern breweries are producing today. You've learned that grit Alesh weren't just alcoholic beverages, but liquid medicine, probiotic supplements, and water purification systems all rolled into one ingenious solution. But that raises an obvious question. If medieval people were smart enough to create such advanced brewing systems, how did they manage to avoid poisoning themselves with everything else they ate? Because let's be honest, we're talking about an era when people didn't know what bacteria were, had never heard of pasteurization, and thought disease was caused by bad air or moral failings. We're talking about a time when the same water that people dumped their chamber pots into was also supposed to provide drinking water, when meat was preserved using methods that would horrify modern health inspectors, and when food storage techniques involved leaving things in underground chambers for months without any temperature control. And yet somehow, medieval people not only survived, but thrived using food safety practices that worked despite violating every principle of modern food safety science. Welcome to the bizarro world of medieval food safety, where people developed effective techniques through trial and error, where sensory evaluation was more reliable than laboratory testing, and where traditional knowledge kept people alive using methods that modern science is only beginning to understand and appreciate. Here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Medieval food safety practices actually worked better in many cases than our modern systems because they were based on thousands of years of practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge that might or might not apply to real-world conditions. Medieval people didn't need to understand germ theory to develop techniques that killed germs. They didn't need to know about pH levels to create preservation methods that prevented harmful bacteria. They just needed to pay attention to what worked and what didn't, then pass that knowledge down through generations of people who couldn't afford to get it wrong. Let's start with preservation techniques. because medieval people developed methods that were so effective they're still being used today by people who want food that actually lasts without chemical additives or industrial processing. Dry salting involved completely burying meat or fish in salt, creating an environment where harmful bacteria literally couldn't survive because all the moisture was sucked out of both the food and any microorganisms that might want to make it their home. Medieval preservation techniques included sophisticated salt curing processes that modern food scientists have confirmed as genuinely effective at preventing spoilage and foodborne illness. The dry salting process worked by drawing moisture from both the food and any harmful bacteria, creating conditions where pathogens couldn't survive or reproduce. Brine curing used carefully calibrated salt water solutions that created hostile environments for bad bacteria while allowing beneficial preservation processes to proceed. But medieval people didn't just throw salt at everything and hope for the best. They developed specific techniques for different foods that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how preservation actually worked. Fish required different salt concentrations than meat. Different cuts of meat needed different treatment times. Vegetables needed entirely different approaches that balance preservation with maintaining nutritional value and palatability. The smoking process was equally sophisticated, combining salt pre-treatment with carefully controlled exposure to wood smoke that contained antimicrobial compounds. Medieval people understood that different woods produced different preservation effects. Oak for certain flavors and preservation qualities, apple wood for others, and hickory for still different results. They didn't know about the chemical compounds involved, but they knew exactly which combinations worked for which foods. Medieval regulatory and social controls around food safety were actually more effective than many modern systems because they were enforced by people who had direct stakes in the outcomes. Urban food laws in major medieval cities included comprehensive regulations that would impress modern health departments. 13th century Paris had specific fines for butchers who sold tainted meat, with penalties severe enough to put vendors out of business if they repeatedly violated food safety standards. London's Assize of Bread and Ale, 1266, didn't just regulate prices but also quality standards that protected consumers from adulterated or unsafe food products. Professional guilds enforced standards among bakers, brewers, and butchers that included specific requirements for ingredient quality, preparation methods, and storage practices. These weren't bureaucratic regulations imposed by distant authorities, but professional standards enforced by people who lived in the same communities as their customers. The guild system created accountability that modern food safety systems often lack. If a baker produced bread that made people sick, he didn't just face regulatory fines. He faced social ostracism, economic ruin, and possibly physical violence from angry customers who knew exactly who was responsible for their problems. This created powerful incentives for food producers to maintain high standards and develop reliable safety practices. Medieval sensory evaluation formed the foundation of food safety in ways that modern people have largely forgotten, but that were often more reliable than laboratory testing. Household manuals from the period include detailed instructions for evaluating food safety using sight, smell, taste, and even touch to identify foods that were unsafe to eat. People were taught to discard foods with rank smells or sour taste that indicated spoilage or contamination. Visual inspection for discoloration, unusual textures, or signs of pest infestation was systematic and thorough. Medieval people developed sophisticated abilities to detect early signs of spoilage that allowed them to catch problems before they became dangerous. The sensory evaluation wasn't just intuitive, but based on accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of people who had learned through experience what safe food looked, smelled, and tasted like. Children learned these skills from their parents and grandparents, creating knowledge systems that were more reliable than individual judgment because they incorporated centuries of collective experience. Medieval cooking methods also inadvertently killed pathogens through techniques that modern food science has confirmed as effective at eliminating harmful bacteria. Extended boiling of stews and thorough roasting of meats achieved temperatures that destroyed most pathogens while creating delicious meals that people actually wanted to eat. The perpetual stew we discussed earlier was actually a brilliant food safety technique because maintaining food at consistently high temperatures prevented harmful bacteria from establishing themselves while allowing beneficial fermentation processes to continue. Modern food scientists have confirmed that properly maintained perpetual stews are actually safer than many conventional cooking methods because they never allow food to enter the dangerous temperature zone where harmful bacteria can multiply. Medieval people also benefited from high-fat content diets that may have provided antimicrobial benefits that protected against foodborne illness. The substantial amounts of animal fats in medieval diets contain compounds that modern research has shown to have natural antimicrobial properties that could help prevent or fight infections from contaminated food. The fermentation techniques we discussed earlier weren't just preservation methods, but active food safety systems that created hostile environments for harmful bacteria while encouraging beneficial microorganisms that improved both safety and nutrition. Medieval people didn't understand the science, but they developed fermentation systems that were more effective at preventing foodborne illness than many modern preservation methods. Medieval food safety also included sophisticated understanding of seasonal risks and appropriate responses that coordinated food preparation with natural cycles to minimize contamination risks. People understood that certain foods were safer during specific seasons, that preservation methods needed to be adjusted based on weather conditions, and that storage techniques require modification based on environmental factors. Spring and summer required extra attention to rapid spoilage due to higher temperatures, leading to emphasis on fresh consumption and immediate preservation of surplus foods. Fall preservation activities were timed to take advantage of optimal conditions for smoking, drying, and fermentation before winter storage. Winter storage required careful monitoring and rotation to prevent spoilage in stored foods that had to last until spring. Medieval people also developed emergency protocols for dealing with suspected food contamination that were often more effective than modern responses. If stored grain showed signs of mold or pest infestation, there were specific procedures for salvaging what could be saved while safely disposing of contaminated portions. These techniques minimized losses while preventing the spread of contamination to unaffected food stores. The social aspects of medieval food safety created community-wide systems that protected entire populations through shared knowledge and mutual accountability. Neighbors watched each other's food preparation and storage practices, sharing information about problems and solutions that benefited everyone. This created early warning systems that could prevent community-wide food safety disasters. Medieval markets included built-in quality control through competitive pressure and customer knowledge that forced vendors to maintain high standards or lose business to competitors. Customers knew what good food looked and tasted like, and vendors who consistently provided inferior or unsafe products couldn't survive in competitive marketplaces where reputation was everything. The integration of food safety with daily life meant that safe food practices weren't special procedures, but routine habits that people maintained automatically without thinking about them. Food preparation, storage, and consumption were conducted according to traditional methods that had been proven safe through generations of use. Medieval food safety worked because it was based on practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge, enforced by people who had direct stakes in the outcomes, and integrated into daily life through cultural practices that made safe food handling automatic rather than deliberate. When we abandoned traditional food safety practices in favor of industrial methods, we gained some advantages in terms of scale and consistency, but we lost the intimate knowledge of food quality and the community-based accountability systems that had kept people safe for centuries. Modern food safety relies on distant bureaucracies, complex regulations, and industrial processes that most people don't understand and can't evaluate for themselves. Medieval food safety relied on personal knowledge, community accountability, and traditional practices that everyone understood and could participate in maintaining. Contemporary food safety scandals and industrial contamination events demonstrate that our modern systems aren't necessarily more reliable than traditional methods. They're just more complex and less transparent, making it harder for ordinary people to protect themselves when the systems fail. Medieval people understood that food safety wasn't something you could delegate to experts or institutions, but something you had to understand and practice yourself if you wanted to stay alive. They developed systems that worked because they had to work, and they passed down knowledge that had been tested through generations of practical use. Maybe it's time to admit that staying alive without science required more practical wisdom than staying alive with it. 11. Seasonal eating as survival strategy. Why eating local wasn't a choice. So you've discovered that medieval people developed food safety systems that worked better than many modern methods, using practical wisdom accumulated over centuries instead of theoretical knowledge that might or might not apply to real-world situations. You've learned that traditional preservation techniques, community accountability, and sensory evaluation kept people alive using methods that modern science is only beginning to understand and respect. But here's where that practical wisdom really shines. Medieval people didn't just know how to keep food safe. They knew exactly when to eat what, why timing mattered, and how to coordinate nutrition across an entire year using nothing but observation, experience, and the kind of planning that would make modern nutritionists weep with envy. Welcome to medieval seasonal eating, where eating local wasn't a trendy lifestyle choice, but a matter of life and death, where people understood nutrition timing better than most modern athletes, and where survival depended on coordinating food production, preservation, and consumption across annual cycles with precision that would impress military logistics experts. This wasn't some romantic connection to nature or primitive inability to access global food networks. This was sophisticated nutritional planning that achieved better health outcomes than most modern diets while using only locally available resources and traditional knowledge. Medieval people didn't eat seasonally because they wanted to feel connected to the earth or reduce their carbon footprint. They ate seasonally because eating out of season meant starving to death, and they developed systems so sophisticated that modern nutritional science is still trying to understand how they achieved such remarkable health outcomes using techniques that seem impossible without industrial agriculture and global supply chains. Let's start with the most terrifying part of the medieval food calendar, the Hungry Gap, that brutal period between late winter and early spring when stored food was running dangerously low, new crops hadn't started producing yet, and survival depended on whatever scraps, preserved foods, and forage materials you could find to bridge the gap between last year's harvest and this year's first edible plants. The Hungry Gap typically lasted from March through May, depending on climate and weather conditions, and it was the time when medieval communities faced their greatest nutritional challenges. Store grains were running low after months of consumption. Preserved meats were either consumed or starting to spoil. Root vegetables in storage were sprouting or rotting, and fresh food was still weeks or months away from being ready to harvest. Medieval people developed sophisticated strategies for surviving the Hungry Gap that demonstrate remarkable understanding of nutritional timing and resource management. The key was understanding that spring wasn't just about waiting for new food to grow. It was about knowing exactly what was available when, where to find it, and how to process it into edible nutrition that could sustain people until the regular food system came back online. Spring foraging became a critical survival skill that medieval people mastered with scientific precision. They knew exactly when the first edible wild greens would appear, which plants provided essential nutrients that had been missing from winter diets, and how to process wild foods that required special preparation to be safe and nutritious. This wasn't casual plant gathering, but systematic harvesting of wild resources that had been carefully observed and cataloged through generations of experience. Early spring greens like chickweed, dandelion, and nettle provided vitamin C and other nutrients that had been scarce during winter months when scurvy and other deficiency diseases posed serious health threats. Medieval people understood that these first wild plants weren't just food, but medicine that could reverse nutritional deficiencies that had developed during months of preserved food consumption. Medieval households also developed sophisticated rationing systems that managed preserved stores throughout winter to ensure that some food remained available during the Hungry Gap. This required careful calculation of consumption rates, accurate estimation of storage life for different preserved foods, and strategic reserve management that balance current nutrition needs with future survival requirements. The rationing wasn't just about making food last longer, but about understanding which preserved foods provided the most essential nutrition during different periods. Certain preserved foods were specifically saved for the hungry gap because they provided nutrients that were most critical when fresh food wasn't available. This represents sophisticated nutritional planning that coordinated preservation methods with consumption timing to optimize health outcomes. Medieval people also coordinated community resources to help everyone survive the hungry gap through sharing arrangements, cooperative foraging, and mutual support systems that ensured no household faced starvation alone. These weren't charity programs, but practical survival strategies that recognized that community survival depended on everyone having enough nutrition to work and contribute during the critical spring planting season. But surviving the hungry gap was just one part of a comprehensive seasonal eating strategy that coordinated nutrition throughout the entire year with precision that modern dietary planning rarely achieves. Medieval people understood that different seasons provided different nutritional opportunities and challenges, and they developed eating patterns that optimized health and energy based on seasonal food availability and work requirements. Autumn, September-November, represented the most intensive period of the medieval food calendar, when harvest activities required enormous energy expenditure while simultaneously providing the year's greatest food abundance. This was when medieval people needed to consume maximum calories to fuel intensive physical labor while also preserving surplus food for winter and spring consumption. Medieval autumn diets emphasized high-calorie foods that provided energy for harvest work while taking advantage of seasonal abundance that wouldn't be available again for months. Fresh fruits provided quick energy and essential vitamins. Nuts offered concentrated fats and proteins that sustained workers through long days of physical labor. New grains provided carbohydrates that fueled muscle activity, while surplus grains were processed for preservation. The autumn preservation activities were coordinated with consumption patterns to ensure that the most perishable foods were consumed fresh, while less perishable surplus was processed for long-term storage. This required sophisticated understanding of food chemistry and storage characteristics that allowed medieval people to optimize both immediate nutrition and future food security. Winter, December-February, eating patterns focused on preserved foods that provided sustained energy for indoor work and heating during cold months when physical activity was reduced but caloric needs remained high due to cold stress. Medieval winter diets emphasized fats and proteins from preserved meats, fermented dairy products, and stored nuts that provided concentrated nutrition during the season when food variety was most limited. Medieval people understood that winter nutrition needed to compensate for reduced sunlight, limited fresh food variety, and increased energy requirements for staying warm. They developed preservation techniques that maintained nutritional value in stored foods while creating variety through different preparation methods that prevented monotony and nutritional deficiencies. Winter fermentation activities continued food processing that had begun in autumn while creating probiotic foods that supported digestive health during the season when food choices were most limited. Sauerkraut, fermented dairy products, and preserved meats provided beneficial bacteria that modern research has confirmed as essential for immune system function and overall health. Spring, March-May, represented the transition period when medieval people gradually shifted from preserved foods to fresh options while managing the hungry gap and preparing for summer's food abundance. This was the most challenging season nutritionally because it required balancing declining stored food with emerging fresh options that weren't yet abundant enough to provide complete nutrition. Medieval spring eating emphasized wild greens, early herbs, and emerging vegetables that provided nutrients that had been scarce during winter months. The timing of this transition was critical because starting too early could exhaust stored food before fresh options were adequate, while waiting too long could result in nutritional deficiencies that affected health and work capacity. Spring also included dairy abundance, as animals began producing milk after winter dormancy, providing fresh proteins and fats that supplemented stored foods while new plant foods became available. Medieval people coordinated dairy consumption with preservation activities that created cheese and other preserved dairy products for later consumption. Summer, June-August, brought food abundance that medieval people used to replenish body weight and nutritional stores that had been depleted during winter and spring while simultaneously preparing for the next preservation cycle. Summer eating emphasized fresh foods that provided maximum nutrition while surplus was processed for preservation. Medieval summer diets included fresh vegetables that provided vitamins and minerals, fresh fruits that offered concentrated sugars and nutrients, and fresh dairy products that supplied proteins and fats. The abundance allowed medieval people to restore nutritional status while building energy reserves for autumn harvest activities and winter survival. Summer preservation activities prepared for the next annual cycle by processing surplus foods using techniques that had been perfected through generations of experience. Medieval people understood that summer abundance needed to provide nutrition for the entire following year, requiring careful balance between immediate consumption and long-term storage. The integration of seasonal eating with work patterns demonstrates sophisticated understanding of nutritional timing that coordinated food availability with energy requirements throughout the year. Medieval people ate high-energy foods during periods of intensive physical labor and emphasized store nutrition during seasons when fresh food was scarce but work continued. Medieval seasonal eating also included feast and fast cycles that were coordinated with food availability and religious requirements. Feast periods coincided with food abundance and allowed communities to consume surplus foods that couldn't be preserved effectively. Fast periods often coincided with natural food scarcity and helped conserve stored foods while maintaining community solidarity. The health outcomes achieved through medieval seasonal eating were often superior to modern dietary patterns because they provided nutritional variety throughout the year, emphasized fresh foods when available, and included preserved foods that maintained essential nutrients during periods of scarcity. Medieval people developed robust immune systems and physical health that supported demanding lifestyles using only locally available resources. Contemporary seasonal eating movements are essentially trying to recreate the nutritional wisdom that medieval people maintained automatically through practical necessity and traditional knowledge. Modern farm-to-table dining, community-supported agriculture, and seasonal menu planning attempt to capture the benefits of eating patterns that were once common knowledge among people who couldn't afford to get nutrition wrong. The abandonment of seasonal eating in favor of global food systems has provided year-round variety, but at the cost of nutritional optimization, environmental sustainability, and food security that seasonal eating provided naturally. Medieval people achieved better health outcomes using seasonal eating patterns that modern nutritional science is still trying to understand and replicate. Medieval seasonal eating represented the ultimate integration of practical wisdom, environmental adaptation, and nutritional optimization using only local resources and traditional knowledge. They developed eating patterns that sustained healthy populations for centuries using techniques that modern dietary planning is desperately trying to recreate. Maybe it's time to admit that eating local wasn't a limitation, but a sophisticated nutritional strategy that worked better than what replaced it. 12. Kitchen tools that put modern gadgets to shame. So you've mastered the art of seasonal eating, coordinating nutrition across an entire year with the precision of a military operation and the wisdom of generations who understood that timing wasn't just important. It was the difference between thriving and dying. You've learned to read the calendar like a survival manual, knowing exactly when to forage, when to preserve, when to feast, and when to carefully ration your way through the hungry gap using nutritional strategies that put modern dietary planning to shame. But here's the final piece of the puzzle that'll completely destroy your assumptions about medieval primitiveness. All of this sophisticated food mastery was accomplished using kitchen tools that were so cleverly designed, so brilliantly engineered, and so perfectly suited to their tasks that they make your modern gadget-filled kitchen look like a collection of overpriced plastic toys. Welcome to medieval kitchen technology, where a single tool could outperform half the gadgets cluttering your countertops, where mechanical systems operated for centuries without breaking down, and where every utensil was built to last lifetimes rather than plan for obsolescence. This wasn't primitive tool-making by people who didn't know any better. This was sophisticated engineering by craftspeople who understood that when your survival depends on your equipment, you don't mess around with cheap, flimsy, disposable nonsense. Medieval people created kitchen tools that solved multiple problems simultaneously, operated without electricity or batteries, and worked so effectively that some are still in use today after 500+ years of continuous operation. While we're throwing away broken food processors and replacing burnout mixers every few years, there are medieval mortars and pestles that have been grinding spices for longer than some countries have existed. Let's start with the mortar and pestle, because calling this tool primitive is like calling a Stradivarius violin just a wooden box with strings. The medieval mortar and pestle wasn't just a grinding tool. It was the universal food processor. Available in multiple sizes, from tiny spice grinders that fit in your palm to massive mortars requiring 2 people to operate and capable of processing entire harvests of grain, herbs, and preserved foods. Medieval mortars and pestles featured specialized materials chosen for specific purposes that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of materials science that modern kitchen gadget manufacturers are still trying to achieve. Stone mortars provided the perfect grinding surface for spices and grains, with interior textures that were carefully designed to optimize grinding efficiency while preventing ingredients from escaping during use. Metal mortars offered durability for tough materials and repeated heavy use. Wooden mortars protected delicate items that could be damaged by harder surfaces while providing antimicrobial properties that enhance food safety. But here's where medieval engineering gets really impressive. These tools were precisely shaped to optimize grinding efficiency through understanding of physics and mechanical advantage that modern food processor designers are still trying to replicate. The interior surfaces were textured to enhance grinding action, while the shapes were designed to create grinding patterns that processed food more effectively than most electric appliances. The size range was extraordinary, reflecting the reality that medieval kitchens needed to process everything from individual spice portions to bulk quantities for preservation and community feeding. Tiny mortars handled precious imported spices that required careful measurement and grinding. Medium mortars managed daily cooking needs for household meal preparation. Massive mortars could process entire harvests of grains, herbs, and other materials that needed bulk processing for preservation and storage. Archaeological evidence shows that wealthy households maintained collections of mortars and pestles in different materials and sizes, creating integrated processing systems that could handle any food preparation task more effectively than most modern kitchen equipment. Professional kitchens in monasteries and castles featured enormous mortars that required specialized techniques and multiple operators, representing industrial-scale food processing using completely manual systems. Medieval mortars and pestles also served functions that modern kitchen gadgets struggle to replicate. They could create perfectly smooth pastes and purees without the heat generation that destroys nutrients in electric food processors. They could grind spices to exact consistency preferences that pre-ground commercial spices can't match. They could process tough materials like bones and dried meats that would break modern appliances. The durability was legendary. Many medieval mortars and pestles are still functional after centuries of use, while modern food processors typically last 5 to 10 years before requiring replacement. Medieval tools were built for permanence using materials and construction techniques that prioritize longevity over convenience or cost reduction. But mortars and pestles were just the beginning of medieval kitchen sophistication. Medieval kitchens featured comprehensive straining and processing equipment that created smooth sauces, perfect purees, and precisely processed ingredients using mechanical systems that were often more effective than modern electric alternatives. Fine mesh cloths, created from specially woven fibers, could strain sauces to smoothness that rival modern commercial food processing. Perforated spoons in multiple sizes handled different foods with precision that modern slotted spoons can't match. Metal graters featured both fine and coarse surfaces created through careful metalworking that produced cutting edges sharper and more durable than most modern graters. Specialized cheesecloths weren't just simple fabrics, but precisely woven materials designed for specific straining, wrapping, and forming functions. Different weave patterns and fiber types were chosen for different applications, creating specialized tools that modern cheese-making supply companies charge premium prices to replicate using industrial manufacturing. Medieval fire management tools achieved precise temperature control that modern cooking equipment struggles to match. Without thermometers or digital controls, medieval cooks used mechanical systems and traditional techniques that provided more accurate heat control than many contemporary cooking methods. Specialized bellows created controlled airflow that allowed precise fire intensity management. Different bellows designs provided different airflow patterns for specific cooking needs. Gentle air for maintaining low heat, powerful bursts for creating high heat, and steady flow for consistent temperature maintenance. These tools were crafted with understanding of airflow dynamics that modern fireplace equipment manufacturers are still trying to achieve. Adjustable andirons allowed fine-tuning of fire characteristics and heat distribution using mechanical systems that provided precise control over cooking conditions. Different andiron configurations created different heat patterns, cooking zones, and fire characteristics that could be adjusted based on cooking requirements and fuel types. Medieval fire management also included specialized shovels, tongs, and implements designed for precise coal and ember manipulation that allowed cooks to create specific heat conditions without modern temperature controls. These tools enabled heat management that was often more precise than modern gas or electric cooking because medieval cooks understood fire behavior at levels that modern cooks rarely achieve. But perhaps the most impressive examples of medieval kitchen technology were the mechanical spit systems that cooked food automatically using engineering principles that modern kitchen appliance designers are still trying to replicate. These systems used gear trains, pulleys, and counterweight systems that provided even cooking through automated rotation powered by heat differentials, weight systems, or human power. The gear systems were remarkably sophisticated, featuring metal gears precisely cut and assembled to provide smooth, consistent rotation that could operate for hours without attention. Counterweight systems maintained steady rotation regardless of the meat's weight distribution as it cooked and lost moisture. Some systems included speed control mechanisms that allowed adjustment of rotation speed based on cooking requirements. Medieval castle kitchens featured enormous spit systems that could handle multiple large pieces of meat simultaneously using integrated gear systems that coordinated multiple spits with single power sources. These systems represented industrial-scale cooking equipment that operated using completely mechanical systems without any electrical components or modern technology. The most advanced spit systems included automatic basting mechanisms that applied cooking liquids to rotating meat using mechanical systems triggered by the rotation itself. These systems achieved even cooking and flavor development that modern rotisserie equipment struggles to match using far more complex electrical and electronic controls. Medieval kitchen organization systems integrated all of these tools into comprehensive cooking environments that were more efficient and effective than most modern kitchen designs. Storage systems kept tools organized and accessible while protecting them from damage and contamination. Work surfaces were designed to optimize food preparation workflow using understanding of ergonomics and efficiency that modern kitchen designers are rediscovering. Professional medieval kitchens featured specialized tool storage that kept different implements organized by function, size, and frequency of use. Hanging systems maximized accessibility while minimizing storage space. Protective storage prevented damage to delicate tools while maintaining easy access for daily use. The integration extended to coordination between different tools and cooking systems that created seamless workflow from raw ingredients to finished meals. Medieval kitchen design understood that tools needed to work together as integrated systems rather than individual gadgets that operated independently. Medieval kitchen tools also demonstrated superior material science through use of specialized metals, woods, and other materials chosen for specific properties that enhance tool performance and durability. Different metals were selected for different cutting applications based on their hardness, corrosion resistance, and edge-holding ability. Various wood types were chosen for different tools based on their density, antimicrobial properties, and resistance to wear and staining. The craftsmanship involved in creating medieval kitchen tools represented specialized skills that required years of training and experience to master. Tool makers understood metallurgy, woodworking, and material science at levels that allowed them to create implements that were perfectly suited to their intended functions and built to last centuries. Contemporary artisanal kitchen tool makers are essentially trying to recreate the quality and functionality that medieval craftspeople achieved routinely using traditional materials and techniques. Modern heirloom-quality kitchen tools attempt to replicate the durability and performance that medieval tools provided as standard features rather than premium upgrades. The abandonment of traditional kitchen tool design in favor of modern appliances has provided convenience and speed, but at the cost of durability, versatility, and often effectiveness that traditional tools offered. Medieval kitchen tools worked better, lasted longer, and often produced superior results using designs that modern kitchen equipment manufacturers are struggling to improve upon. Medieval people understood that kitchen tools weren't just implements, but essential equipment that needed to perform reliably for decades or centuries without failure. They created tools that were more sophisticated, more durable, and more effective than most modern replacements, while using completely sustainable materials and manufacturing processes. Maybe it's time to admit that the best kitchen gadgets are the ones that never need upgrades, replacement parts, or warranty service.